Hello and welcome to the World Built Environment Forum webinar series. My name is Fabrizio Varriale, and in today's webinar we will be discussing 4 initiatives that constitute what we have called the UK whole life carbon ecosystem. To tell us about these initiatives and how they align and interact with each other, we have 4 excellent panelists today with us. We have Will Arnold, Head of Climate Action at ICE-Direct-E. Good afternoon, Will.
Hello.
Thanks, Will. James Fisk, Chief Executive Officer at BCIS. Hi, James.
Hi, Fabrizio. Delighted to be here.
Thanks. Also have Julie Godefroy, who's Head of Net Zero at CIBC. Welcome, Julie.
Hello, everyone.
And Anil Soni, who's Head of Sustainability at RICS. Hi, Anil.
Thanks, Fabrizio. Hi, everyone.
Thanks, and thank you very much, Will, James, Julie, and Anil for joining us today. Before we start, I'm really glad to say that we have over 600 registrations for this webinar from 39 different countries. So it's really an international audience. And though we are here to talk about what is happening, particularly in the UK, we want to compare this to what's happening elsewhere in the world and explore how we can learn from other countries and what other countries can learn from the UK ecosystem. We will now start to present the 4 initiatives individually. I will begin with a short introduction just to set the scene, then pass on to each panelist. We will then have a panel discussion all together. I have some ready questions for our panelists, but this is also your chance to ask questions. So please do submit questions to our panel, as it does really help to bring the conversation to life. If you are new to these webinars, you should see that you can submit questions at any time using the question box on your screen, and we'll pick them up as we go during the panel discussion. So why are we doing this? Why do we want to reduce carbon emissions from buildings? The simple answer is that buildings are responsible for a large share of carbon emissions. Globally is nearly 40% if we consider both operational carbon, which is emitted during the building use, and embodied carbon, which is emitted mostly during manufacturing, construction, and demolition. In the UK, buildings are responsible for a lower share of emission compared to that 40% at global level, but are still one of the major contributors. The UK has committed to reach net zero by 2050, and to do so, really all sectors of the economy must decarbonize, and that includes construction and real estate. And you can see from the graph that there have been significant reductions in the past years, but there's still a long way to go. And a whole life carbon approach is needed to reduce both embodied and operational carbon. So to do this, the UK industry has brought forward 4 initiatives, 4 components of this so-called ecosystem. There is not a big master plan behind this, but these 4 initiatives have grown organically in response and in alignment with each other. Now, the first component is the RICS professional standard on whole life carbon, which will be presented by my colleague Anil. The second component is the proposal for an amendment to building regulations to cover whole life carbon, which will be presented by Will. The third component is the UK net zero carbon building standard, which will be covered by Julie. And the fourth component is the built environment carbon database, presented by James. So the purpose of this webinar is to showcase the aim and the scope of each component and highlight how they work together. I will now want to pass to Anil to talk about the RICS professional standard. Anil, over to you.
Thank you, Fabrizio. So once again, welcome on behalf of RICS and the World Built Environment Forum. As you know, RICS released the 2nd edition of the Whole Life Carbon Assessment Professional Standard 2nd edition in September 2023, which has now gone live in terms of its being effective starting 1 July 2024. A bit of histrionics. The first methodology for calculating embodied carbon in the built environment was released by RICS in 2012. The first edition of this whole life carbon assessment, first edition was released in 2017. So you can see that our members and RICS together, we've been on this journey for some time and building on that initial effort and success, the second edition is now available on our website and is to be followed by our members. So what is WLCA standard? It's in true form, it's the methodology for measuring and reporting GHG emissions from buildings and infrastructure assets throughout the life cycle. So this second edition has been built on the basis of the success of the first edition, which was primarily a UK document, but was being used globally. We had a set of external experts who helped build the second edition. Alongside them was our RICS members expert working group and public consultation when this document was being prepared and before it's released. In fact, we ran through 2 rounds of public consultation. The standard, which I said is a methodology for measuring and reporting, is globally applicable. And in our second edition, we have connected it to another standard, which is the International Cost Management Standard, third edition, which has a taxonomy for reporting life cycle costs and life cycle carbon emissions. The standard in itself is open, transparent, freely available from our website, builds on other ISO and EN standards. It utilizes a consistent, practical, and comprehensive approach for measuring and reporting emissions along all modules, as Fabrizio had shared, modules A, B, C, and D. We also provide mechanisms to report biogenic carbon separately. The embodied carbon can be reported as upfront, life cycle, end of life, embodied carbon. Optionally, assessors can also report user carbon, so it's very comprehensive. It's aligned with cost planning because of its alignment with ICMS third edition. You could assess various options of low carbon buildings or infrastructure assets alongside emissions with life cycle costs also. The standard is open, so it's quite data driven. We provide guidance on what type of data to be used at what life cycle stage of the asset, and it integrates very well with building information modeling and a common data environment. The standard is particularly well configured to essentially do trade-offs and carbon costs and benefits, so you can analyze an option for its upfront embodied emissions versus its operational benefits. So it's very comprehensive in that space. The standard also is supported with the help of Excel-based templates, primarily for reporting, and a number of appendices that talk about grid decarbonization, material decarbonization, biogenic carbon calculations, and many other guidance that one would need if you had to sit down and do an assessment for a building or perhaps a transportation network. We also provide additional guidance. There is a client guide that's available on our website, which is essentially for clients or appointing parties to search for service providers. It's a very simple guide that doesn't go into the details of the 220-page standard itself, but gives important pieces of information before you appoint an expert. We also last year, Fabrizio and myself produced a document which talks about harmonization. As you can imagine, even though our standard is global, but there may be some local regional laws, contexts that require some changes. So if there are changes, how do you harmonize your assessments for comparison benchmarking purposes? We have produced a national playbook for implementing this ecosystem that Fabrizio talks about. We are in a pilot stage of a software validation program. 2 vendors are currently completing that process. Once that process is completed, the software validation program will be available publicly to other software providers, essentially giving a badge to software vendors about the alignment of their software to the whole life carbon assessment for the built environment. We do provide training for our members and non-members. To get more information, you can go to our WLCA hub. I provided a link at the bottom. So overall, we have received a very good market response. About 29,000 downloads of our standard, the second edition, thus far. We have now signed some collaborative agreements with number of entities, beginning maybe in Australia, working closely with Transport for New South Wales, who are using our standard alongside ICMS and PS 2080 for their infrastructure pipeline. We are also partnered with Expo City Dubai. They're using this standard for their real estate portfolio and so on. Last month, we have signed a collaborative arrangement with an entity called iMasons. iMasons stands for Infrastructure Masons. They are a global professional body for experts and organizations working in the data center space. And Microsoft, Google, and all other big players in the data center space are part of the Infrastructure Masons Climate Accord. And through that agreement or collaboration, we are hoping to promote the use of WLCA in that important space also. So Fabrizio, that's pretty much what I wanted to cover, and I'm going to hand it over to Will.
Thanks, Anil. So I'm going to introduce Part Z, although I should sort of declare a conflict of interest in having been involved in all of the other items that we're talking about today as well, as I think most of us have in one way or another. So Part Z, for those who haven't come across it before, this is an industry-backed proposal for regulating embodied carbon in the UK. If you're listening from outside of the UK, it's possible you work in a country where there is already regulation on this topic where you work. In the UK at the moment, this is it's completely voluntary as to whether or not you choose to care about embodied carbon. So the industry is calling for Part Z to be introduced to change all of that. So the purpose of Part Z as a document is basically to provide a sort of consistent, mandated reporting methodology that would apply to the embodied carbon aspects of buildings. I should say that operational energy use has been regulated in the UK for quite some time now, and our operational carbon emissions, particularly in new builds, are dropping sort of year on year as the grid decarbonises. So embodied is all that's left, and in the UK, embodied carbon is about 10% of emissions. So the purpose of this is to give us that consistent reporting methodology to tackle that fairly sizable chunk of the UK's emissions. In terms of the process behind the document, so that, I mean, you can download this document for free. If you go to the link in the bottom left corner, which is part-z.uk, you can download a copy of this. It's a really short approved document and a really short piece of amendment to the building regulations, and it basically it's been written as a sort of proof of concept, if you like, to show how this could appear in the building code here in the UK. It was written by a group of 5 industry experts who have experience in the world of embodied carbon, and it was reviewed by a number of others when going through that process. But it's been put out there as this proof of concept. It's sort of to say to the government, you know, this is how you could do it. This is what industry are getting behind. But of course, at the end of the day, it'd be down to government to propose their specific wording for such regulation. So it wouldn't just be a copy paste. It's worth saying that this has got huge support from across the industry. So there's more than 250 different companies have been in touch with myself and the other Part Z authors over the past few years to say that they support this. Everything from household names, large house builders, financial institutions, through all of the main consultant engineering and architecture practices, contractors, developers, professional institutions, and right down to the sort of size of SMEs and even single person firms who have been in touch to say they support this. And they mostly say that for one of 2 reasons, or both of 2 reasons. Number one is a desire for consistency on this topic in terms of what they're being asked to report. So the RICS professional standard tells you how to go about assessing whole life carbon in the built environment, but different developers are asking for different things. Different local authorities across the UK are starting to ask for different things in terms of the submissions that are put in at the end. So some consistency would save time and money for the industry, frankly. The second point of request usually comes from a desire to have a level playing field between firms. So firms who do and don't care about the future of life on this planet are all required to care about that 10% of the UK's emissions. The scope within the document has got some suggested cut-off points so that small projects would be emitted on day one. But of course, again, that could all be tweaked in the final document. The final thing to say before I pass over to Julie is just to spell out like a really key aspect within this document, which is the sort of two-step approach that has been proposed for Part Z. Two steps being that the first step in terms of what would be regulated first would just be that you report embodied carbon following a consistent methodology, and that the second step, introducing limits, wouldn't be introduced until enough data had been collected from that first step. And this follows precedent set by other countries. Often there's been a sort of 2-year lag between starting reporting and starting limits. It would allow limits to be set at the right level. And really what the ask behind Part Z is, the ask to government, is just to sort of start setting out that firm timeline, that direction of travel to introduce such regulation. So that's, I'll hand over to Julie. Thanks.
Thank you, Will. So I'll talk to you briefly about the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard, which is a very large industry initiative. And its purpose really was to define what it means in the UK to be a net zero carbon aligned building. So it's a rule book. It covers most sectors in the built environment. It covers whole life carbon, so operational energy and carbon, as well as embodied carbon. And it is science led in the development of its requirements. Next, please. It's really been a very, very big industry initiative. It's developed by the industry, for the industry. We have hundreds of volunteers and other participants through sector groups specialized in particular sectors of the industry, through topics, through data providers, and now in our pilot program. And the way that the standard works at the moment in the pilot, which was released this autumn, is on the left-hand side, it's got a set of limits. So that's requirements that have to be met, maximum upfront carbon, operational energy, use of fossil fuels, the performance of district heating and cooling networks if the building is connected, the impact of refrigerants, and for some buildings, heating delivered. It also has a target for minimum on-site renewable electricity generation and a set of things that we require to be reported, even if at the moment they are not associated with a limit or target. So life cycle embodied carbon, operational water use, electricity demand with a view to demand management, and heating and cooling for buildings where there's not yet a limit. In addition, as an option, projects can also decide to cover the residual emissions through offsets, but it doesn't change anything with what the building actually has to achieve. Next. The reason why we say it's science-led in that the limits have been developed both in terms of what is achievable for buildings now and in the future. So that's our analysis of operational energy and embodied carbon performance at the building level, but also an analysis of the top-down carbon and energy budgets for the UK and within this for the UK built environment to remain on a 1.5 degree trajectory. And that has informed the development of the standard. Next, please. Thank you. We didn't start from scratch. There's been lots of initiatives, some of which you've heard of today. So many initiatives across industry in the last few years to define the principles of net zero, especially from the UK GBC. Many attempts at covering limits across different sectors, much of that from LETI. There's also been obviously the RICS whole life carbon methodology, which underpins us, but we're really trying to integrate and build on what industry had been doing for a number of years. And we are now, next please, at the stage of the pilot. So I don't know whether anyone in our audience is involved in the program. Thank you if you are. The reason why at the moment it's a pilot is that all the requirements are out, they are available to use through pilot testings or outside of our program. And what we are doing now until the end of the year is testing that pilot, but also developing all the administration for verification and communication around it. So we will soon be issuing a tender for verification bodies who will be the ones in charge of verifying and providing confirmation of conformance. And I'll pass you over to James now.
Thanks, Julie. Hi, everyone. So, yeah, my name is James Fisk. I'm the Chief Exec of something called BCIS, which provides construction cost data to the UK. But the reason I'm on this webinar today is that I also chair something called the Built Environment Carbon Database. And the pressure's really on because, as Will said, everybody who's on the panel has been involved in the Built Environment Carbon Database. So I will do my best to try and represent the project as best I can today. So in terms of sort of setting a bit of background, the Built Environment Carbon Database really came about because in the early 2020s, we were seeing lots of carbon assessments that were being completed in quite an inconsistent way. So you could ask for a carbon assessment to be completed by 5 different carbon assessors for the same building, and chances are you get 5 different answers. Part of that was driven by methodology, people using different boundaries and different sort of scopes, and part of it was driven by using sort of inconsistent data. So at that time, the RICS had a bit of a carbon database which was kind of being used, but we reached out to lots of other sort of professional bodies because we believe that this is a real industry issue that everybody needs to get behind. So we founded a group of us in 2022 and launched something in 2023, which is basically the Built Environment Carbon Database. So it's a pan-industry initiative to provide data, carbon data for the built environment. It's not a calculator, it's not a tool, it's a data repository. Fabrizio, if you don't mind just clicking the slide for me. Thank you. So as the term pan-industry initiative sort of hopefully suggests, there's been huge amounts of involvement across the whole organisation to get us to the point of where we are today, which is BECD being launched in 2023. So you can see the steering group logos on the right-hand side there of some of the professional bodies and other organisations that have been involved. But we couldn't fit all of the logos of all of the organisations involved in BECD because lots and lots of people have given up their time freely to support working groups who have been trying to solve some of the challenges and the issues and accessing some of the data. In the absence of government funding, BCIS has funded the technology to date. BECD, I should say, is a bit of a misleading title because it suggests it's a single database. But BECD is actually made up of 2 databases. The first database is an asset library. So basically that's a database of construction projects for buildings and infrastructure, broken down into elements and the modules that Anil and Fabrizio sort of mentioned in the earlier on in the webinar. And also a products library, so a database of materials and products. Where we are with those at the moment is that the products library contains about 35,000 different material types and contains the A1 to 3 numbers with links over to the source information if people need more. And the assets library is beginning to grow in terms of numbers as well. BECD is free for everybody. It's a free to access system, and pleased today to announce that there's some serious upgrades happening to BECD imminently. The first one is that we have now integrated the inventory of carbon and energy database into the products library. That's now available for BECD. And we've been reworking the assets library, so the database of construction projects, to fully comply with the latest update to the RICS professional standard that Anil introduced earlier. So BECD is available on the becd.co.uk. And again, being a pan-industry free initiative. We need as many organisations to get involved, supporting not just with sharing data, but also helping us to define what is needed from BECD in the future. So yeah, brief intro on BECD. Fabrizio, I believe I'm handing back to you.
Thanks, James. And hopefully it's become a bit more clear how each component contributes to the ecosystem and supports the other one. So we have the RICS professional standard, which provides a comprehensive method for measurement and reporting of emissions from buildings and infrastructure. And we have the PASEP proposal that shows how this can be embedded into building regulations. And then we have the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard, which builds on the RICS standards to provide clear performance criteria so that we can all agree on what makes a building net zero aligned. And we have BECD, which provides the digital infrastructure to support all this so that assessments in line with the two standards can be shared in a transparent and structured way, and progress can be monitored. So hopefully that gives you a perspective of what we call the UK whole life carbon ecosystem. And now let's open the floor for questions to our panelists. We'll start with the questions that I have prepared, but we'll pick up also those that come from the audience. Just bear with me a moment as I stop sharing my screen so I can see who I'm talking to. Great. So I have a couple of questions that are for all the panelists, and then maybe some others that are more specific to some of you. I might just begin to say, this is all well and good, but what do you think is actually missing from this ecosystem? What are the parts that are not there yet, or maybe we haven't included in this presentation, but it is worth mentioning here? Don't know who wants to start with.
I'm happy to jump in, Fabrizio, if you'd like, while
Sure.
all the others have time to think about a response. So for me, in order to complete sort of carbon assessments, you obviously need the methodology, and it's great that we're developing and have released that methodology, which will start to give consistency in terms of what you measure, how you report, etc., etc. You need software. You need software that's compliant with that methodology, and it's great to hear from Anil's intro the software validation program. We're actually one of the pilots going through that at the moment, and it's a great experience. We're learning a lot by working with RICS. So in addition to the software, you need competent and trained people. And I think that's again from Anil's sort of intro. Great to see that we've got some training coming through for the RICS professional standard, and then you need data. I'm just going to focus briefly on the data side of things, Fabrizio. Through the work that we've been doing with the Built Environment Carbon Database, we have unfortunately seen some pretty ropey data. That's a technical description of something that's not necessarily as accurate as it could be. We've seen with the EPDs, the environmental product declarations that are used to underpin the carbon assessments, that unfortunately some fields are not always completed. The reporting measurements are often very inconsistent between very similar materials. So in answer to your question, I think there needs to be a greater focus on data. BECD is step one. It's kind of gathering what data is available. Now we need to look to see where the gaps are and to improve the quality.
If I can add in as well to that, I think something we've not touched on, but that does exist, we just haven't shown it on the diagram today, is the sort of plethora of guidance and training and tools based on reducing the carbon footprint of what we do. Everything we've talked about has been on reporting it and measuring it, and I guess the standard comes closest by saying how low carbon you need to be. But obviously none of this stuff tells you how to do it, and there's loads of information out there that does. So we didn't want to have too many thousands of speakers on today's presentation, but if I was to expand the diagram further, I think I'd try and pick things up like that. And that includes not just, so obviously at ISRT, we run training courses, we have lots of guidance like how to calculate embodied carbon, design for zero and things like that. And there are other specific documents for SIPSI and REBA and so on and so forth. But the the other key document that I think is out there, which is written as a specification published by BSI, is PAS 2080, and that's a sort of carbon management piece. And it's a tool that helps you understand where, depending on your role in a design team or delivery team, where you fit and what questions you should be asking to manage carbon that way. I'm sure there are other things as well that we could add into the diagram if we had time.
Thanks, Will. No, that was great. Actually, it was a good response to a question from David from the audience, which was asking, in fact, apart from calculating and reporting, is there anything that helps us to reduce? And I think you've answered that. Anil or Julie, do you want to add anything?
Sure. So I think much has been already said. I'll probably re-emphasize the importance of data, especially secondary data. We look at global experience. There are parts of the world where the secondary or background data is not that much available, so people are still relying on UK data to do assessments in their countries or regions. So I think emphasis on data is crucial. I think the other thing I want to highlight is the importance of participation of other practice areas, especially quantity surveyors. I think James will be quite pleased to hear this. I think there's an important role, and that's why we connected in WLCA the ICMS standard, which is the International Cost Management Standard, so that you can, I don't think people are going to reduce carbon by ignoring cost. So life cycle cost is important, and therefore contributions of quantity surveyors, RICS members especially, is very important, and that sort of needs to come to the forefront rather than a niche group of sustainability experts or carbon experts doing the whole process. Perhaps inputs from more structured input and guidance and expertise from QSs is also crucial. And I think Will covered this. The question from David, I think PS 2080 references, I believe in clause 7, an assessment method that sort of underpins the whole carbon management process. So the connection is very clear, I think, that ecosystem. And we see that in real world also, as I was giving an example of transport for New South Wales. They have decided to, within their digital engineering framework, as they call it, for infrastructure projects, very explicitly adopted ICMS 3rd edition for cost and carbon, WLCA standard as a methodology, and PS 2080 as a carbon management system. So the connection is quite clear.
Thanks, Anil. Julie, did you want to add anything?
So it's not new elements to what has been said. I guess it's first on skills. I think the skills and the solutions, the tools, in my view, they are there. What is missing at the moment is them being used on a large scale. But everything that, for example, in the net zero standard we've come up with, we think is achievable, and we know of projects that seem to have performed at the levels that we are requiring. So the skills are there. What we want now is big uptake. And on the lack of data, there is certainly going to be a few iterations until we refine exactly what we think is achievable and needed. It's also about the evolution of the requirements. So in some cases, we've been a little bit blunt just because we don't have that much data. So some of the stuff we require is in simple per square meter. I think personally, I would like to see things that recognize a bit more how hard a building works, for example, intensity of use. But in order to do that, we need more data on how the buildings are used, etc. But this is refinements. I think in the last 3 years, there's really been massive progress in alignment on definitions, let alone all the numbers that the standard have come up with, but the methods, the definitions, the database, this is huge progress compared to 3 years ago.
Thanks, Julie. There's a couple of questions from the audience that I saw that it might be good to kind of pick up right away. Stephen is asking, how can the industry move towards clearer building use type CO2 targets while we wait for regulation? As he's saying, there are currently many varying targets from multiple bodies and many set targets that are very easily be beaten or I guess achieved with current construction specifications. So I guess the question is about, the proliferation of that many targets and frameworks and the likes. Julie.
So I guess I'll start because this is precisely what the net zero standard wanted to tackle, and as you can see, it involves a huge number of organizations because we wanted to address that proliferation of targets and one body saying something about one sector, another one about another sector, but slightly different, etc. So it's really the aim of the net zero standard. And what's quite important is that we started with a survey to industry, and industry said, we want a single standard. Don't give us several targets from different bodies. There could easily, at the time, have been a situation where CIBSI, the BRE, the UK GBC each came up with their different targets. It now seems obvious that we came up with a single scheme, but it wasn't at the time. So it's really what we are trying to have. We have limits in energy use, limits in upfront carbon, targets on renewable energy that are the result of huge collaborative works. And I think what's quite interesting is that you can now be at a table and a project team where each discipline with their professional body being involved in the net zero carbon building standard. So they should all be able to give a single piece of advice to a client on what it means to be net zero.
Can I jump in? So in order to provide sort of benchmarks, really that's what the BECD was designed to start to do. So the idea that we capture more and more project data, we understand not just the carbon numbers, but what's driving the carbon numbers behind those projects. And then as that data builds up, then we can start to improve some of those targets and sort of benchmarks that are being used. So yeah, as part of some of the things that we're obviously considering from a BECD perspective, that to do this, we need to capture more and more data.
Thanks, James. Maybe we'll pick up another question still on the UK net zero carbon building standard. David is asking, will there be case studies of the project that have achieved this? Once they can demonstrate at least to a practical level that they have achieved that, because they're noting, the people in design that say, oh, it's not possible, but if there is some evidence that it is possible, that might help to change their mind.
I think I'd start by saying that there are already some out there, and so we have seen architectural firms, other firms posting about projects that they've completed in the past that they believe meet maybe certain aspects of the standard, if not the whole standard. One of our colleagues, Jess Svivnak from the RIBA, was part of a panel who gave a great presentation at Future Build last week, and they touched on buildings that have met with the standard. And I'd also say that we've got, how many is it, Julia? Something like 100 projects registered for our pilot testing program. That's just about a kick off. 200. I didn't think I was worried I would have overshot with that. 200 projects registered for the pilot testing program. So we're going to have a whole load more buildings pop out the other end of that. So I'd say that things are out there, and the name was David, wasn't it, who asked the question? So I'd encourage you, David, to go out there and look for projects that already exist, rather than waiting for them to be written up. I think there's already studies out there that can help you.
And in addition, so Will and I are working on providing a document that explains all the evidence that went into the development of the limits. So we might not be able to name projects and really have case studies, but you should be able to see across each sector what data informed at the bottom-up analysis side, all the limits, and this is just at the pilot stage. Afterwards, once the standard is really up and running, But because projects will be required to be reported through the BCD, you will also be able to access information straight away on the projects that have achieved it.
Thanks, Julie. I did want to ask the whole, you all, what do you think? How do you think that these ecosystem of various components that we described here compare to what's happening in other countries? But also, what can we learn from other countries and what could they learn from us? Will, you mentioned the fact that some countries have started to regulate embodied carbon, others are probably lagging behind, even on the side of operational carbon. So if you could comment on, not only you, Will, if anybody wants to comment on that.
Sure. So I thought in preparation for this, because Fabrizio mentioned that he was going to ask me to speak to the sort of global progress on regulation of embodied carbon, so I thought I'd post something out on LinkedIn and see if it kicked up any fuss. And I got lots of constructive feedback from the post, which is great. So I can give you an up-to-date sort of status report. So at the moment, it's very quickly whizzing around the world. Some US states have effectively regulated embodied carbon in the way we're describing in Part Z. In Canada, there's requirements in Vancouver and Toronto at a city level, and there's at a federal level, any of the government's own property has embodied carbon regulations effectively imposed on it. In the EU, there'll be a requirement from 2028 to report the whole life carbon of all building projects over a certain size, and by 2030 that'll be expanded to all projects, and limits will be imposed by then. So that's 5 years off till limits, but that's on its way. And within the EU, France, the Netherlands, Finland, Sweden, and Denmark have already introduced regulation on this. I think Netherlands started mandating reporting in 2012, so they've had this around for a very long time. New South Wales and Australia has got mandated embodied carbon reporting through planning, and has a voluntary but government-backed national method across the country. Singapore, it's part of an option as part of achieving a number of sustainability points. The list goes on. So you can see that there's different approaches being taken in different countries, but this is all going in one direction. And actually, speaking to you from the UK, we're a bit of an outlier on this. The start of Fabrizio's question, of course, was like how our ecosystem compares with those sorts of countries. And what's really interesting is that in the UK, we haven't yet mandated the regulation of doing any of this. None of this has been mandated, and yet we've built up this really strong ecosystem where we've got the assessment methodology, the reporting platform, we've got a 1.5 degree aligned set of limits and reporting consistency, and we've even got we've even written a proof of concept for what the regs would look like, but it's not mandated yet. In all those other countries I listed, the government direction came first, and then the next thing that had to happen was in country. People had to say, "Oh God, how are we going to get people to report this within the time frame we've been given till reporting starts?" So we're in quite a unique position because we're kind of the wrong way around. And what that should mean is that it should make it very easy for government to start putting all of this into practice and telling the industry that the whole industry has to get behind things such as net zero carbon buildings under Part Z and so on. So maybe when it does come, it'll come quite fast. And maybe that's even more reason to prepare for it if you weren't considering implementing it on your projects just yet.
Thanks, Will. Julie or Anil, James, do you want to add something?
I just maybe sort of building up on what Will said. I think the ecosystem idea, even though Fabrizio, you said up front, it's organic, it wasn't a grand scheme to create an ecosystem, but it works very well because, like for our RICS WLCA standard, has stayed away from specifying targets, limits. It's a measurement methodology and reporting scheme. So as long as parts of these ecosystem map to each other and are aligned and harmonized, I think we can accomplish what Will just mentioned, and that applies globally. So, for example, other pieces which are not mentioned in the ecosystem could be a labeling or a certification program for low carbon buildings. There can be other aspects, including EPD development or PCR development. So this ecosystem is actually quite complex. So our effort should be not only to stand up these components of the ecosystem, but to make sure that they're connected and also mapped, harmonized, and aligned. The second thing I want to say is that the UN Environment Program under the Global ABC is currently in the process of creating a qualitative definition for near zero emission and resilient buildings. So they've picked up this idea of near zero because we have to address both global south versus global north. And that probably addresses one of the questions that's in our chat by one of the participants. By defining both near zero emission and resilient buildings, we're sort of expanding and not just looking at carbon, but also the interlinkages between carbon or climate action and resilience, adaptation, other aspects of the built environment also. So I think a global effort is currently in place, first to produce a qualitative definition and then come up with some building blocks or principles that will lead to those will be globally applicable and will help us move in the right direction.
Thanks, Anil. I saw that there's even more questions from the audience about the UK net zero carbon standard. Not surprising, since it's a hot topic at the moment. Particularly, I saw Zhengan, I hope I didn't mispronounce the name, saying that the targets and in the standard are very challenging, especially for the future ones, and they're asking how those targets were set. Will the database or the data evidence behind it be released? And is the achievement of those targets just heavily relying on the decarbonisation or timber frame? Julian, Will, maybe you want to quickly respond to that?
Sure. So very briefly, there were two bits of work happening in parallel. One was to take the UK's carbon and energy budgets and sort of apportion it down to buildings and work out, effectively how much carbon we can emit if we're to stay within the 1.5 degree trajectory for the UK. And the second piece of work was to collect data from building projects that are real, that exist, and look at what the art of the possible is, to work out how far we can be pushing ourselves. And we termed those two pieces of work, the top down, which was the budget, and the bottom up, which was looking at data. And then we went through a process of allocating limits across the different sectors, seeing whether that gave us a total carbon spend that was greater or less than the budget, and adjusting things until we ended up with a set of limits that just about fitted within the budget, without undercutting what we'd seen within the project data we've received. So we know that the limits are ambitious, but we also know that they're achievable because they're based on real world project data. Future years, so this is particularly relevant to the upfront carbon limits on the embodied side. Limits in future years are, yes, they are largely reliant on the decarbonisation of materials. And we do need, particularly our big emitters like steel and concrete, to decarbonise in the future if we are to meet those limits. So you would struggle to meet the 2040 upfront carbon limit today because we just don't have those materials available to us. But there are other levers in there as well. So there's material efficiency, simply using less stuff. There's putting the right material in the right place. And as an example of that was within the residential sector, where there was studies out there demonstrating how much carbon you could save by switching over to timber frame housing, as an example. And combining those levers, those are things that can be done today. And so those are the sorts of actions we'd expect to see people taking today. So this is not just about waiting for materials to decarbonise or waiting for certain bits of technology to become available. These limits are achievable today, and will be achievable in the future, assuming that the assumptions behind the data, which, as Julie has said, we're going to sort of publish in the forthcoming months, such as what they lead to.
Thanks, Will. I see that there's a question from Hannah on the audience, and they're asking if a carbon management system being integrated into asset management system and building management system, so organization can factor carbon management across their asset portfolio. I guess it's a particularly hard question because it probably depends where this is happening or to what extent. But maybe, James, I wanted to ask you something also related to this, and you might touch on this as well, because you work with BCIS, and if you could maybe expand onto this, which is, my questions was like, how do we integrate particularly embodied carbon measurement into construction practice? And are there lessons or synergies with, which I think you were touching upon a little bit before, with the cost assessment and reporting practice?
Absolutely, yeah, it's a great question and probably a full webinar in itself if we're not careful. So I'll try and keep it brief. Yeah, so quantity surveyors in the UK, they are already measuring things for the purposes of sort of cost measurement, cost control sort of purposes. So in my humble opinion, yes, there is a massive overlap between the measurement process that we need to do for cost and the one that we need to do for carbon. And yeah, certainly we've been doing a lot of stuff at BCIS to sort of link cost and carbon together to make it easier for the quantity surveyors to do that activity. So sort of, you know, taking the question from Hannah, if we're able to do that cost and carbon link properly, linking it over to things like building information models and obviously the life cycle costing activities that a quantity surveyor would do, and the whole life carbon that we're talking about in terms of the reporting here, you can see that there's a direct link between the cost, the carbon, the asset management sort of processes that Hannah was referring to there. So I think we've got the building blocks in place to get some of those integrations working. The big sort of question mark is probably now less on the data and more on the training and building the capability of people to be able to do that link. Good question there.
Can I add something to that, Fabrizio?
Of course.
So I think on building on top of that, BIM, Common Data Environment, CDE, that data or digital thread, golden thread of information would help connect asset management, building management systems. Digital twins are already in play, which especially during the life of an asset provide real-time edge data from the building itself for you to monitor what's happening. I think AI, no webinar should go today without the use of word AI. So AI could help. On the aspect of connecting it with construction. So if you're a constructor, where is the connect? There is an interesting connect, like here in the US, the Associated General Contractors of America have basically come up with a pilot program where they are asking contractors to create a template A4 and A5 emissions. So data is being collected. You can then start seeing connections to construction waste. So if there is a lot of rework on construction sites, literally you are throwing away that embodied carbon by breaking and throwing concrete. So that connection is coming clear. There are many tools available today to capture that. You can take a photo of materials arriving on site or of any rework that you've done, and it can connect back not only to material waste, process waste, but I guess in this case, waste and emissions also.
Can I just chip in
of course,
thought on this, which is just to reiterate that, of course, whilst yes, certain people in the team are going to be best placed to sort of assess and analyze and pull together all the final numbers on carbon, the problem that's in front of us is one of reducing carbon, not just analyzing it and reporting it and measuring it. And that is everybody's problem, right? When we overrun on a financial budget on a project and we start doing value engineering, everyone's expected to chip in and bring ideas to the table. It's not left up to whoever worked out that we were over budget to then solve all the problems. And as an engineer, you know, I've spent half my career trying to do value engineering for our schemes, trying to come up with cheap ways to do things. And even before that's happened, when you're designing the structural frame in the first place, you're expected to have an understanding of what's cheap and what's expensive. That's why columns end up either circular or square, not sort of beautifully fluted or shaped like corn on the cob or something. So similarly, we need people involved in designing construction to have an understanding of what's high carbon and low carbon, and to be able to design for that and not just leave it to the number cruncher at the end to then work out what's going on.
100% agree with that, Will. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, didn't mean to mislead to sort of say that no one else should bother about this. It was more, yeah, the definitive reporting accounting numbers need to be a bit more defensible. So yeah, good point.
Thanks, everybody. We're getting close to the end of the hour. I think there's maybe time for a quick kind of answer. There was think an interesting question from Michael, who was bringing a brighter, larger perspective, and they're asking, with a UK focus on growth, do you see any potential conflicts or unintended consequences or specifying embodied carbon limits or targets for buildings? So, for example, in terms of the UK economy, potentially offshoring carbon emissions. If you could maybe if you want to quickly respond, yeah.
Thank you. So there's two topics here. So first, in the development of the limits for the net zero standard, we've actually modeled a few scenarios on growth. So we have the sort of expected trajectory, and then we've modeled much more housing, etc. So we have essentially a range of scenarios to stay within the carbon budgets. And obviously, if you build more, you might spend more carbon, but it's the limits for building are still, what the net zero standard does is a limit on whatever you've already decided to build, whether it's new or retrofitted. So the bigger view on how much growth we can take is slightly different. A limit to a building doesn't necessarily address the fact that there will be a new building. It's a different issue. But at the moment, we will publish the data, the analysis that we have done on the impact of various growth scenarios. The other point is on offshoring. So just to be clear, at least in the net zero standard, we take account of real emissions. So the embodied carbon limits apply to whatever is domestic plus all the materials that you've imported. And similarly, our modeling of the UK impact includes also whatever has been produced internationally. We don't just assume that produced elsewhere will not affect the budgets. I'm sorry if this is a bit of a woolly answer, but I think the question conflated two issues.
That could be, Jude, but I think that was clear. Not sure if Anil or James wanted to add. I believe Will had to leave us a little bit earlier, and he sends his apologies. There was a very last question, a bit, maybe one that, yeah, it does need another webinar. David was asking if by decarbonising, do we mean deindustrialising the UK and essentially, outsourcing the production of carbon-heavy materials and the likes. I don't think we mean that at all. But maybe if James or Anil or Julie, you want to kind of quickly respond to that.
Yeah, definitely. Pushing the problem over to another part of the planet isn't going to solve the issue here. So, no, we certainly don't mean that.
Yeah, I think it's very related to the point I've just made. We just look at the real embodied carbon impact, whether it's UK born or elsewhere.
Yeah, and I might add also that if it is produced elsewhere, it will have that embodied carbon impact. It might be much bigger. And there are also policy shifts that are going towards recognizing effectively that things that are produced elsewhere might not have been done to the same standards that have been done here. So I'm thinking, for example, European carbon border adjustment mechanism, and something similar might also happen in the UK. But as said, this is a very large topic and for another time. So, and I'm afraid our time for today is at an end, but thank you very much, Will and James, Julie and Anil for joining us today and sharing your insights. I'd just like to remind the audience that we will publish a recording and a written summary of this webinar online. Please feel free to share those with your professional networks. Please also take a moment to let us know what you thought of today's session by completing the online poll, which will appear on your screens at the end of the webinar. Also, you can check out the forthcoming webinars on WBF platforms, which you should be able to see now on the screen in a moment. I particularly look forward to the one about decarbonizing data centers. If you require any further information, please search rscs.org/WBF, or you can search World Built Environment Forum on LinkedIn. Many thanks again very much to our panelists and to our audience as well. I hope you really have enjoyed the conversation today. I certainly will. I certainly did. Until next time, goodbye.